وقنا عذاب النار ربنا هب لنا من ازواجنا وذرياتنا قرة اعين واجعلنا للمتقين اماما واخر دعوانا ان الحمد لله رب العالمين. So just to continue on the theme from last time, if you recall, I was talking about, spent a lot of time talking about the hijab situation, the organs, the hijab. And we talked about the situation in India with our brave sister facing off, against bigoted sort of hatred and racist and so forth. And my intent was to extend that conversation into lessons from the Sahaba and upbringing of the youth, with a very special focus on the youth. So this is what today is going to be about, inshallah. It's going to be about examples from the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. We're going to see, for example, examples in battle. We're going to see examples in knowledge. We're going to see examples in governance, from the companions, so that the youth can learn from them and really start to make them our heroes. And if you remember last time, I gave this example. I said that, there was a poll in Egypt that was done, 15 years ago, with students in Cairo University. And if you remember, I said, let's use those results as a cross-section of the Ummah, where students were asked, these are later grade students, so these are not young students, these are third, fourth years of university. What are the biggest problems on your mind? And they were all legitimate problems. They're about getting married, getting a good job, gap between me and my professor, gap between me and my parents, this whole notion of, drugs and alcoholism and so forth, which were all legitimate things. But I think what I said was the real thing that we have. Yes. Oh yeah. Can I? Do you want me to pull it up for you? Open up YouTube. Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah, here, let me do it for you. So if you open up YouTube for a second. And just look up. Yeah, this is it. Sorry? Yeah, here's it. But it's the Battle of Badr specifically. Okay. So we're going to have a big focus today on the Battle of Badr. So there's something I want to show you as we talk through this. So I said all these things were legitimate, but the key thing that our youth lacks as an ummah is this notion of the lack of ambition, the lack of doing something really amazing, right? Of thinking big, right? For not just for themselves, all these concerns about marriage and job, all very legitimate, but doing something bigger for the ummah, whether it's a forum for da'wah or it's a forum for governance or participation in like the brother, I don't know, he's not here, but I know he comes to Bothell, the one that won in the city of Bothell. Like that's an over and above thing. Like he didn't have to, you guys know what I'm talking about? Brother Rami, like this wasn't something, he had a full-time job, alhamdulillah. But these are the kinds of things that we should be doing to help, move the ummah forward. And then the other thing I said, just as a quick review, I said that our youth needs to start to think about themselves in a different way from the time they attain puberty, right? Because in Islam, from the time you attain puberty, the perspective of deen on you is different when you were a child. When you were a child, things didn't count, quote unquote. It didn't matter what you did, right? When you flip that age, whether you're a male or a female, now the camera and the record button is on, so to speak, right? So your thinking needs to change and evolve in the same way that your age changed and evolved, right? And these are fairly young ages that one of the challenges we have in the societies we live in, especially in the Western societies, is people think of themselves as babies and young at this, even at a young age. I'll tell you guys a funny story. I was actually just mentioning it to some friends yesterday. So I was in Egypt, a month ago, or I don't know, 6 weeks ago now. And I was at an event where I met a lot of older relatives that I hadn't seen in 40 years, in some cases. They still, 50 years ago, they still think of me, and because I didn't live there long, they didn't see much, they still think of me as this 5-year-old kid. So what's funny is, like, here's a guy that's, approaching 60, they're like, oh, come on over, let me give you a kiss, but I moved on, right? So we don't need to do this anymore. And the problem with living in the West is, they still teach, look at little kids as little kids until they're maybe 18, 19 years old. That's not how Islam perceives it at all. That's not the perspective of Islam. on the youth, right? So then we started to think about some of who are as-sadiqun, right? So some of the who are, anyone notice as-sadiqun, the early winners, right? Also refers to them in Quran. Who are they? They're the early Sahaba that helped the Prophet ﷺ, that carried the burden of da'wah, that carried the burden of jihad, that carried the burden of Islam at a very young age. And we look at the roster of who they were actually very young youth. Like, yes, there were some older men, right, older companions, but the majority of them were very young, and we'll talk about some of these examples today. But first I'm going to give you, it's up, okay, so give me a second, we'll get there in a second, okay. So here's the first quiz. The first quiz is, there's this notion of the 10 al-ashar al-mubashirin, the 10 that have been giving, glad tidings or commitment of Jannah, okay, the 10. So this is now the test. So let's try to go through who are the 10. I'm going to give you 4 so that you don't have to say them, okay? Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, yes, that's right. Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab, you're right. Sayyidina Uthman ibn Affan, you're exactly right. Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib, you're right. Now, go. Talha ibn Ubaydillah, mashallah. So who was Talha ibn Ubaydillah? Okay, so this is why, so I'll tell you, okay, but this is why it's important, I'm saying this to the adults and the kids at the same time, for us to know these companions so that we set them as the standard and example for our kids. We have to know them to set them, because if we don't pick who the heroes are for them, you know what they're going to do? They're going to pick TikTok superstars, and that's who they're going to pick. It's not because they're bad, but we didn't tell them who to pick. So we should hold these people up in modern regards, right, as their heroes, right? So Sayyidina Talha ibn Ubaydillah, and you don't have to know, like, I'm not asking for a full biography. All you need is a tweet. Who was he, right? What did he do? Talha ibn Ubaydillah was the cousin of Sayyidina Abu Bakr. He was the cousin of Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. He was actually one of the key industrialists of Medina, meaning he was super rich. Right? There's a story about him where he couldn't go to sleep because of how much money he had in his house. The story is narrated by his wife. She says he kept tossing and turning in bed. And then he turns to her and he says, how can a man sleep when he has 100,000 dirham in his house? How can a man sleep? Now, do you know what he did? What was his business? What was he? He wasn't an Amazon.com guy. He was a cheese merchant. And he became abundantly rich. And she says he wouldn't go to bed until he got up, and he brings his crew, people working in his factory, to take and distribute this wealth to the poor people of Medina, right? So this is one example. Talha ibn Ubaydillah. Okay, who else? MashaAllah, Abdurrahman ibn Auf. Okay. Huh? Another rich industrialist of Islam. The story that's famous about Sayyidina Abdurrahman ibn Auf is what? The caravan comes to Medina, there's a big hunger, and they say, hey, we'll buy your food, we'll buy all the stuff. He's just coincidentally arriving from Bilad al-Sham. He's arriving from a business trip. We would say he's arriving from a business trip. And his caravan is packing a bunch of food. And there's hunger in the city, and they say, hey, we'll buy this stuff from you. And what does he say? He says, no, I'm going to sell it to someone who's going to give you more. So they start to round up the other businessmen of Medina, the other Muslim businessmen, like you think of the richest of the rich. They show up and they're like, hey, we'll buy it. We'll give you 50% on your profit. He says, no. We'll give you 100% of your profit. He says, no, I've sold this to someone who'll give me more. And they say, who's going to give you more? Who's going to give you more? And he says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he gives them all fi sabilillah. This is Sayyidina Abdurrahman ibn Auf. Zubayr ibn Awam is another one. Zubayr ibn Awam, very famous Muslim leader, right? Army general, right? So his specialization was different. But one of the things you learn from the Sahaba is they don't all have to be the same. Like we think somehow they all were amazing at fiqh. They all were amazing. It's not true. That's just not true. The skill set that Sayyidina, for example, Sayyidina Abu Hurairah brought to the table is very different from the skill set that Sayyidina Khalid bin Walid brought to the table. Both are needed, but they're very different. Very different. You understand? Now, everyone has to have the basic minimum knowledge of deen, of haram and halal. No one can say, I can't make wudu. No, I'm not the expert on wudu. Ask him. There's no such thing. Everyone has to know how to make wudu. Everyone knows how to pray. Everyone knows how to fast in Ramadan. Everyone has to have those skills. But your specialization could change. based on your skill set, right? And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran. What does He say? He says, قُلْ كُلٌّ يَعْمَلُ عَلَى شَاكِلَتِهِ فَرَبُّكُمْ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنْ هُوَ أَهْدَى سَبِيلًا. Let everyone work according to the best skills that they bring. Everyone has shakila, shak. Everyone has a different skill set. Everyone has a different personality. Everyone has a different attitude. And that's fine. Work for Islam with whatever you can bring best to the table, right? Okay. So, we talked about Abdurrahman ibn Auf. We talked about, did we talk about Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas? Okay, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. Who was he? What's he famous for?
Military, right?
Military.
Yeah.
Battle of?
Badr.
No. Qadisiyah. He was the military general that led the campaign that actually liberated Persia and specifically liberated the White House of Kisra. It's literally called the Abiyadu Kisra, as the Prophet ﷺ refers to him. It means the White Palace. So he had a palace completely built of marble. It was something like the Arabs had never seen. Like they, you know, it's like if you take a super poor person that's never seen anything like, and you suddenly put him in an amazing 7-star resort that's golf and this and waterfalls. They, you know, they've never seen anything like this. So that's what he liberated, right? That's what he led. And he has a very famous saying, which is when they enter into the palace, they enter into this palace, and what would you see normally? Like, let's say downtown Seattle, last year or the year before, Black Lives Matter, all this smashing the window stores, right? Now, by the way, I'm for Black Lives Matter, so I'm not against it. I'm just explaining bad behavior that can happen as an outcome. What do people do when they smash the stores? They shoplift. They loot all the stuff that's expensive. So I'm carrying a TV set. This guy's carrying a pair of sneakers. They didn't touch any of that. The companions never touched any of that. And he actually starts to cry. He didn't start to cry because the palace was liberated. He said the Prophet ﷺ told us that this would happen. But what really moved him was how this youth, how these Sahaba that had been brought up by the Prophet ﷺ that were all relatively poor. These were not super rich people. The soldiers, the regular foot soldier, right? And they left everything on its own. The level of honesty that they had, right? Okay. So did we say Sa'id ibn Zayd? Sa'id ibn Zayd? Did we say Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah? Abu Ubaidah, what's Abu Ubaidah known for? What was he very famously known for? What did he participate in that was a really big deal? When Sayyidina Umar went to him and got angry at him about what he said, even though it was a happy event. The liberation of Jerusalem, Bayt al-Maqdis. It was Abu Ubaidah that called Sayyidina Umar al-Khattab from Medina. And he said to him, hey, these Romans have surrendered, but they're not giving me the keys. They said they're only giving the keys to the head of the state. They're only going to surrender to the head of the state. And they kind of know your qualifications. They're kind of describing you. So can you come over from Medina to accept the keys? And Sayyidina Umar makes a long trip from Medina with his servants all the way to Bayt al-Maqdis. It's a long trip. And he was on a camel and he'd exchange places with the servants. So sometimes he'd ride, sometimes as they get to the walls of the city, all the cities of these days were walled, right? And you can imagine the cities all lined up with like soldiers and the Archbishop of Jerusalem and this and that and whatever Romans are left over. The Muslim army's outside. And at the time they come to approach the city, when the people could see them, it was the time for the servant to be riding the camel and not Sayyidina Umar. And Sayyidina Umar is now wading through mud. So he has a torn up jilbab and he's going through the mud and he's pulling the camel. And when he comes out on the other side, Sayyidina Abu Ubaidah, who's dressed in like prime military uniform, like completely back from the dry cleaners, super clean, all decked up, because this is an important event. He looks at him and he says, you embarrassed us. You embarrassed us. What are you doing? Right? And what does Sayyidina Umar say to him? Does anyone know? He got so upset when he said that. What did he say? He says, oh, ya Abu Ubaidah. He says, oh, Abu Ubaidah. Oh, he's like, oh, Abu Ubaidah. If someone else other than you had said that, meaning if someone that wasn't as knowledgeable as you had said that. And then what does he say? He says, wallahi, words that should be written in gold. He says, لَقَدْ أَعَزَّنَا اللَّهُ بِالْإِسْلَامِ لَقَدْ أَعَزَّنَا اللَّهُ بِالْإِسْلَامِ وَمَهَمَا ابْتَغَيْنَا الْعِزَّةِ فِي غَيْرِ اللَّهِ أَذَلَّنَا اللَّهُ. He says, Allah has given this ummah only through Islam. Allah has given this ummah honor and power only through Islam. And if the ummah starts to seek its power and its izzah and its pride in other things, whether it's pan-Arab nationalism, whether it's nationalism of any kind, whether it's oil, whether it's this, whether it's that, it's always going to fail. He sets up a formula. He says the number one goal of the Ummah should be Islam. It's fine. You want to be proud of where you come from? That's fine. There's no problem with that. Of course, make use of the resources Allah has given you. But the number one thing needs to be Islam. The number one thing, right? Okay. Got all 10. There's going to be a test next week. So, okay. Okay. Allah, Bismillah. Okay. So, okay, so let's talk about Sayyidina Zubayr ibn al-Awwam. I think we talked to him. He was the first cousin of the Prophet. He was but by the way, Sayyidina Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, before I move off of him, he was a famous Muslim general across many situations. But his real claim to fame, from all the military situations he was in, was the Battle of Ridda. After the death of the Prophet ﷺ, when many people decided to make Ridda against Islam. And what was the Ridda like, by the way? Does anyone know? What was their primary Ridda? What was it? The death of the Prophet. Well, what did they say? They did not pay their zakat. I'm giving this as a bad example of one element. I don't want to depress anyone here, but like, think today in the ummah of the amount of people that say, look, the hijab is optional, like sometimes when I speak to some people, it's very sad. They say, this Ramadan thing, man, was a long, long time ago. Today we can't do it. We're so busy all the time. We're this, we're that. And people start to make their own mental excuses. These are Muslims. Forget the non-Muslims. I don't care about the kuffar. Talk about the Muslims themselves. Right? Sickness within the ummah. Right? Ridda was because they said they're not going to pay the zakat. And Sayyidina Abu Bakr, by the way, Sayyidina Abu Bakr's character, what was his character like? Does anyone know?
He's very gentle.
Very gentle. Very gentle. Sayyidina Abu Bakr was the last guy you'd say like excited and wants to go to war. He was a very gentle man. And when he hears this, he says, Wallahi, if they stop giving one thing that they used to give to the Prophet ﷺ, I will go to war against it. This is dropping Islam. It's like someone showing up and saying, I'm going to do everything, but I'm going to drop Salah. Or like a famous loser, I'm not going to mention even his name, very famous leader at one point in time said, I believe everything in the Quran, but I believe nothing in the Sunnah. This happened in history, modern history. I'm not going to take any of the hadith. Right? This is an example of this kind of attitude. It's the same kind of attitude, right? And so Sayyidina Zubayr ibn al-Awwam is the one that really his claim to fame was, and he was from the first people, by the way, that were al-Mubashirin bil Jannah. Does anyone know how old he was when he was given Bushra of Jannah? When he started, he's 15 years old. How many people here are 15 or 14 or 16? MashaAllah. So think about it, guys. Like, look at these guys. Look at these brothers. Like, they're that age. They're that age, and they're already taking up these positions of leadership, right? So this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of the way we think of our kids and the way our kids think of themselves is not the way Islam looks at them, whether it's potential or capabilities or strength or anything like that, right? Okay. Talha ibn Ubaydillah, we talked about him. By the way, Talha ibn Ubaydillah wasn't just a big industrialist. He has a really famous event in the Battle of Uhud. Does anyone know what happened in Uhud? Talha ibn Ubaydillah. So much so that Sayyidina Abu Bakr and Sayyidina Umar comment on this particular thing later, and they say he is the one لَقَدْ ذَهَبَ بِأُحُدٍ, which means he took all the thawab of Uhud. Does anyone know what he did? Do you know remember when
he acted like a shield?
He acted like a shield. He acted like a shield, and he was covering the Prophet ﷺ as the Prophet was retreating up into the mountain. And what did he get hit with? He got hit with multiple arrows in his back. So he's moving the Prophet ﷺ up Uhud, right? And he is getting hit in his back. And then the companions describe, they say, his back looked like a porcupine from how many arrows he had in the back. His back was like a porcupine to protect the Prophet ﷺ. Okay. We talked about Sayyidina Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and Battle of Qadisiyah. He was, by the way, Sayyidina Talha ibn Ubaydillah was 16. Sayyidina Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas was 17, right? So think of these ages, right? 17 years old. Another one we didn't talk about. Arqam ibn Abi Arqam. Here's another example from the companions. Does anyone know? Arqam ibn Abi Arqam. Very famous place you hear about in Mecca called Dar al-Arqam. What is Dar al-Arqam?
First place where Islam was.
The first? Yes,
Sahaba
that's right. He dedicated his home to the teaching of Islam with the Prophet ﷺ. But what was very special about what he did at that time? Where was this? In Mecca or Medina? Was it harder or easier? Very hard. Very hard. He was like today when this guy's teaching terrorism in his house. you know what I mean? Like, let's find them, capture them, follow these Muslims where they're going. He made his house dedicated for this. The Prophet ﷺ taught in his house 13 years. Think about that. This became the University of Islam, right, in Mecca for such a long period of time. By the way, just as another side note, does anyone know, okay, this is a bit of a trick question because none of what I'm going to say is even there anymore, but has anyone been to Mecca in the 90s? No? Okay. Forget it. It's not relevant. I was going to tell you where his house was, but it doesn't matter. Okay. All right. Okay. Let's skip over these details. Let's see. So I'm going to give you one example before we see this video, and I want to comment on the video we're going to see in a second because it's important. So so now let's just talk about Badr. So we're approaching the Battle of Badr. And we generally know the circumstances of the battle. Yes, I mean, Badr was basically about the caravan of Abu Sufyan that the Muslims tried to capture on the way north, but they couldn't do it. Why? Because he took the coastal route. So just to give you an idea, like we have this idea that, in those days, you just go out in the desert and you walk, right? Like there's no highways, like we have I-5. None of that is actually true. Okay, none of that is actually true. So they didn't have highways. So that's what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is there were known routes that people took. In the same way that we say there's the highway, there's the main road, and there's the back road, the same thing existed in their time. And why were those important? Because that's where they found water, that's where they had stops, that's where they knew people, those are the roads that the guy. That's why when you read, for example, the story of Sirah, the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ, he brought an expert, one of the people that he brought over to help him and Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, was an expert GPS, you could say. He was a GPS guy, he wasn't even a Muslim. And he said, no, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go south, we're going to stay here for a few days, you're going to think we're here, then we're going to go north, we're going to actually head towards the ocean, then we're going to take a right and go up to, these things existed, these roads existed. So anyway, on the way to Hashem, the Muslims heard about them and they tried to intercept them, but he took the coastal route, which was not a major highway. This was a side road, right? On the way back south, the Muslims had heard about the caravan again, and they tried to go after them again, but remember, Mecca was the superpower of the Arabs, yes? So they had spies everywhere. So they went and alerted him, right, about 100 kilometers north of Medina, and he said, hey, they're waiting for you, you better hurry it up. And what did he end up doing? He ended up accelerating the caravan. It's like, look, if I'm driving 60 miles an hour, and I continue at this pace and stop for sandwiches here and buy a coffee from Starbucks there, they're going to catch me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to floor it to 90 miles an hour. I'm not going to stop for sandwiches in the Starbucks like they think I'm going to do. And that way, that intersection choke point, I'm going to pass ahead of them. And that's what happened on the way back, right? Now, what else did they do on the way back? He took an emissary. So Abu Sufyan radiallahu anhu, by the way, became a Muslim. Yes, so Abu Sufyan, we say radiallahu anhu, because he became a Muslim. When did he become a Muslim? Fath Makkah, the liberation of Mecca, right? Okay. So Sayyidina Abu Sufyan radiallahu anhu, when he heard about this, what did he do? He sent a fast emissary. Caravans are slow. He sent a fast emissary to Mecca. Now they had a thing that they did in those days when they wanted to show how humiliated they were, which is they'd send the emissary, and by the time he's entering Mecca, they put him on the horse backwards. And then he would go in and he would say, oh, they're going to catch us. Oh, they're going to kill us. Oh, the terrorists are there. Come and help, come and help. So he made a ton of drama about the fact that the caravan was safe, but I wanted to let you know, this is what they were going to do. Abu Sufyan actually wasn't calling for an army. Do you understand? Like, he wasn't actually calling for the army of Mecca to come out. Who decided the army should go out? Abu Jahl. Abu Jahl, right? Who they called Abu Hakam. So actually, as Muslims, they call him Abu Jahl, but Abu Hakam means the father of wisdom. He was anything but wise, right? And he said, we are going to be dishonored if we don't go and fight for our own honor. We have to gather up the army. Their force is going to be very weak and very, very minor. So these guys are have light weapons and they're not really ready for a big fight. We're going to go and catch them and we're going to finish them off once and for all. So he prepares the army, he fires up the men, and he goes over to meet them. Okay. So what I'm going to show you now, I'm not going to show you the whole thing. It's 22 minutes. You can watch it home when you go home. But I'm going to show you from about minute number 6 or 7 to the end. I just want to explain to you what this is. This is a series on YouTube called Kings and Generals. And has anyone ever heard of that? Okay. So Kings and Generals is an amazing series. This series is actually made by non-Muslims, but a lot of Muslims are on the team. Okay? And this focuses specifically on military expeditions. By the way, Muslim military expeditions and non-Muslim military expeditions. So if you're into military history, you're going to love this. So a lot of the detail, like he'll say Muhammad, for example, we'll say Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he doesn't say it. I'm just explaining to you what you're about to see. And also understand that this is focused specifically on the military elements of the battle, okay? So we're going to watch a piece of it, and maybe I'll pause you a few times just to comment on what's being said. So let me just let go of this so I can move on. Go ahead and move up to minute number 6 or 7, I think. Yeah, go ahead. So by the way, before we start, so the good thing about this, in case if you don't know, obviously this has some really good maps. So I'm not going to sit on everything, comment on everything in the maps, but you can see, for example, Al-Yamama, I don't know if you can see that now. This is where actually the Ridda battle, the final castle, the final holdout of the Muqtaddin was. You can also see that they define the key cities of the Arabs, and what's a little bit harder to read in the other font below it is the names of the tribes. Like you'll hear in the Sirah, oh, this person from this tribe. So it shows you the distribution of the Arab tribes. The major power obviously is in Mecca. This is the superpower of everyone else. And then over here, up to the right, the Sassanid Empire, up until the city, Stepastion or whatever it's called, that was actually one of the capitals of Kisra. This is the Persian Empire. And then the Roman Empire had everything else, including the green area, down into Bilad al-Sham, up into Egypt and North Africa. And then some of the Arab tribes, for example, Dawmat al-Jandal and Tabuk and all of them were agents of the Romans, right? So both sides had agents working on their behalf. Okay, let's go ahead and play it.
Persecution in Mecca, the Muslims suffered at the hands of the Quraysh who seized their property. This event is known as the
So we do it at home? Probably. So we do it at home. Okay, let's let people watch it at home. We can send them the link, inshallah. But if you just go on YouTube, yeah, if you just go on YouTube and you look up, just look up Kings and Generals. There's a whole series, but look up, the search should be Kings and Generals Battle of Badr. Okay, you also find Kings and Generals Battle of Uhud, for example. So you'll find all the, in fact, they have coverage all the way to the Ottoman Empire and beyond. So you should definitely watch it with your kids. This one's especially good and relevant. So I'm now going to move the conversation to the Battle of Badr. We know now the circumstances and why it's happening. And we're going to talk about some events that happened in Medina and some events that happened at the battle itself. So has anyone heard of someone called Zayd ibn Thabit? Zayd ibn Thabit. Sham? لا مش زيد بن ثابت. Hassan ibn Thabit. Zayd ibn Thabit was actually one of the most knowledgeable people of Quran. One of the most knowledgeable people of Quran. So much so that Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu at the time of his Khilafah, he would have him check, when they started to write it, he would have him check. He was the QA guy, right? That actually said, yes, this is right, right? Sayyidina Zayd ibn Thabit was 13 years old, and the army was about to move to Badr. And his brother brings him to the Prophet ﷺ. And she says, my son wants to go with you to fight. My son wants to go with you to fight. So he looks at her and he said, he's too young. He's too young. Now, Sayyidina Zayd ibn Thabit, he wasn't a big guy. He didn't go to the gym every day. He didn't do weights. He was quite young. He was a little bit on the weaker side. So the Prophet ﷺ said, I can't take him. So now what does the mother say?
Yes, wait.
Calling for me, I have to go.
Let's send it. Just send it to the team, and watch it when we go home, inshallah. So his mother says, well, how else can he serve Islam? So she thinks for the son. This is an example now for us. The mother knows what skills Sayyidina Zayd brings to the table, and she says to the Prophet ﷺ, she says, my son is a smart kid. She says, my son is a smart kid. He learns things very quickly. Is there any way you can use him? Is there any way you can use him? So what did the Prophet ﷺ do with him? Does anyone know? He made him a scribe of the Quran, no less, right? What else? He asked him to learn languages. He became the official translator of the Prophet ﷺ. You know when you see today head of state walk around, they're meeting like the president of a different country, and there's this person this was Sayyidina Zayd ibn Thabit, 13 years old. He learned the language of the Hebrews. He learned the Hebrew, which was the language of the Jews in Medina. He learned the Syrian. He would be the one that would translate the messages for the Prophet ﷺ when he would exchange the messages, right, with the other empires, right? So this is Sayyidina Zayd ibn Thabit, right? Okay. We're now going to move the camera to this battle scene that you're going to watch when you go home. And this particular scene focuses on two companions that we really don't talk about much at all. Okay. By the way, they were by most accounts they were 14, 15 years old. Now they got to participate in battle of Badr, and if you read the books of Sirah, the Fuqaha say basically they were very strong and big. Like they weren't just like Sayyidina ibn Zayd had a different build. Like people come in different builds, right? Like you see 2 13, 14-year-old people, right? Kids or whatever. One's mashallah built like the Incredible Hulk, and the other maybe isn't, right? So this is kind of the difference between them. So they're now monitoring the battle. The battle has started. So I wanted to kind of show you the effects of the battle, but the battle has started effectively. This particular scene we're looking at, and then Sayyidina Abdurrahman ibn Auf, who we said is a famous general. So by most accounts, he's the one that the Prophet ﷺ had a command and control tent in the back. That's what Prophet ﷺ was, and this is where the wells were, by the way, behind the Muslim army, right? And Sayyidina Abdurrahman ibn Auf, he was running field operations, if you like, for the Muslims. So he narrates this hadith. So this hadith is actually a very long hadith, and Sayyidina Abdurrahman ibn Auf is the one that narrates this hadith. And you can find this in Bukhari, by the way. So he says the following. I'll read the Arabic and I'll read the English. He says, إِنِّي لَفِي الصَّفِّ يَوْمَ بَدْرٍ إِذِ الْتَفَتْتُ فَإِذَا عَنْ يَمِينِي وَعَنْ يَسَارِي فَتَيَانْ حَدِيثَا السِّنِّ فَكَأَنِّي لَمْ آمُنْ بِمَكَانِهِمَا. So he says, I was in the line, meaning the battle line, on the day of Badr. Right? So he's on the front lines of the battle of Badr. And he says, I looked to my right and I looked to my left, and I found two younger boys. Fatayan. Like, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to Ibrahim alayhi salam as a fata. سَمِعْنَا فَتًى يَذْكُرُهُمْ يُقَالُ لَهُ Ibrahim. A fata in the Arabic language is like between 14 and 17 years old. Like literally that's how old Sayyidina Ibrahim was when he was stored as a fire, when he destroyed the statues. He was a young man, right? So he says, like he turns to his left, it's like, I don't know if I'm happy here. That's basically what he's saying. I don't know if I feel safe with these kids, right? And who were they? One was called, does anyone know their names? MashaAllah, Mu'adh ibn Amr ibn Jamuh was one of them. And the other one is? So the first one is Mu'adh ibn Amr ibn Jamuh, and he was to the right, and he was about 13 or 14 years old, and then to his left was, the other companion's name was Mu'awwad ibn Afra, he was 14, 15 years old. Right? And they were from where? They were from the Ansar. They were not from the Muhajirin, right? And they're standing in line next to Sayyidina Abdurrahman ibn Auf, and they were both obviously, eager to participate. And then the hadith goes on. قال لي أحدهما سرا من صاحبه. So look at the beautiful description of Sayyidina Abdurrahman. He says, so one of them says secretly to me, so his other friend on the other side doesn't hear. He's like, psst, psst. Hey, like this is literally what's happening on the front lines of the battle. He says, hey, which one of those guys over there is Abu Jahl? Because I heard he's cursing at the Prophet ﷺ, I don't want to make him pay. Right? And like, why are they asking him this? They want to kill him, okay. They have the real fervor in Islam for him against the enemy of Islam, right? Fir'aun hadi al-ummah, as the Prophet ﷺ called him. But why is he whispering?
He wants to take the.
He wants to take their reward and not his friend, right? So they're both friends, but he's like, he doesn't want his friend to know, right? He wants to do it himself, right? And by the way, he says to him, yeah, I'm uncle. So like, you can already tell, like, there's a big difference between us, like, Ammo, like, which one of these is, this. فقلت يا ابن أخي, so saying he says, فقلت يا ابن أخي, like, hey, my nephew, فما تفعل, what are you going to do with him? Like, leave him alone, like, like, let the big boys take care of him, right? Let the big boys take care of him. فما تصنع بي؟ قال أخبرت أنه يسب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. He said, I was told that he curses at the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. I just heard that. Is that true? If that's true, I'm going to finish him off. Right? قال, and then he goes on to say, قال والذي نفسي بيده. So he swears to him. He says, والله, if I see him, لا يفارق سوادي سواده. This is an Arabic expression that they use at the times of battle. لا يفارق سوادي سواده حتى يموت الأعجل منا. So he says, والله, if I face him off, I'm not going to let him go until one of us finishes off the other. Like, I'm not going to let him go, right? And then Sayyidina Abdurrahman, he comments on this and he says, فَتَعَجَّبْتُ لِذَلِكَ. So he says, I was really surprised. I was really surprised by the attitude of this young man, right? قال عبد الرحمن وغمزني الآخر. And the other one was like, hey, uncle, right? Where is this guy? And he says the same thing to him. And literally, Ghamazani, like one guy whispered, the other guy, Ghamazani, he's like, hey, I don't want anyone to know, right? What my plan is, right? And this is like, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say in the Quran about this kind of attitude where people are competing for reward? What's, the ayah in the Quran? وَفِي ذَلِكَ فَلْيَتَنَافَسِ الْمُتَنَافِسُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in doing good, let there be the real competition. Right, in doing good, whether it's donation, working for the masjid, making da'wah to Islam, let that be the competition, right, that you guys have, right? So, يقول عبد الرحمن بن عوف. So, عبد الرحمن بن عوف, he goes back and says, فلم أنشد أن نظرت إلى أبي جهل. So he says, coincidentally, I found him on the other side. Like, he saw him, right? يجول في الناس, walking amongst people. يجول في الناس, so he's walking amongst the whole group of people. فقلت ألا تريان. So he says to them, don't you see, he's saying out to the two boys, هذا صاحبكم الذي تسألاني عنه. That's the person that you guys are asking about, right over there, right? يقول معاذ بن جموح سمعت القوم. So by the way, parts of this I cut out, but Sayyidina Abdurrahman now describes them both as when they saw him, they took off like guided missiles. Like he actually says they took off like arrows, right? But they basically left their spot and they went, now they didn't just charge him, they tried to kind of figure out how to get to him. Now, the rest of the hadith is narrated by one of those companions, right? So he says, يقول, so Mu'adh ibn Amr ibn Jamuh, he says, سمعت القوم, which means the mushriks, سمعت القوم, the mushriks, they say, وأبو جهل في مثل حرجة. So Abu Jahl is in the middle of a bunch of bodyguards. The leader of the army, you don't just leave kind of, walk along the battlefield, you keep him protected. And harja literally means like a small forest. Like you can imagine, like there's a bunch of guys, and he's right in the middle. They're all holding up spears, or holding up swords, or whatever they're holding up, protecting Abu Jahl. Right? He's right in the middle of it. وَهُمْ يَقُولُونَ. Now he's close enough to hear what they're saying. وَهُمْ يَقُولُونَ أَبُو الْحَكَمْ لَا يُخْلَصُ إِلَيْهِ. Which means take care of Abu al-Hakam. He's the one that's leading us. He's the one that's going to give us the victory. Take care of him. Protect Abu al-Hakam. Right? فَلَمَّا سَمِعْتُهَا جَعَلْتَهُ مِنْ شَأْنِي. فصمت نحوه. So he says, when I heard them say this, I waited for the right opportunity. فلما أمكنني حملت عليه. When I found the right opportunity, I basically charged at them. And we don't know what that was. We don't know whether that was a gap in the bodyguards. He found an opening. He did something. But he basically charged them like a full-on wrestler. Right? By the way, for the young kids in the room, this next section is going to get pretty violent, so I'm letting the parents know in advance. Like, this is rated R for violence, okay? Okay. فلما أمكنني حملت عليه فضربته ضربة. So he attacked him and he hit him once with his sword. So let me just explain about these swords. Has anyone ever seen the swords of the Muslims? Is anyone here interested in military history? Have you ever seen pictures of them? You can actually buy books, by the way, that describe this. In fact, I should have brought some of them with me. But the swords, not just the Muslims, by the way, but the swords of the time were extremely heavy. Has anyone heard of a place in Turkey, in Istanbul, called Topkapi Palace? Has anyone been to Topkapi Palace? Have you guys been in the museum? Okay, so you guys know what I'm talking about. So there's a museum in Turkey, in Topkapi Palace, which used to be the palace of the Sultan. And many of the antiquities in it are from the companions, and they say some of the things are from the Prophet ﷺ, Allahu Alam, but definitely you can see the swords. These swords are massive. So brothers, if you haven't seen these swords, these are not like, we see Star Wars and they pick up these plastic lightsabers. This is nothing like that. These are major, very big swords made of metal. And I want to give you a sense of the kind of physical fitness you need to be in to be like them in this kind of battle. Like, I went to the gym, I ran for 3 miles, and I did weights. Like, these are people that had to go into battle, right? Sometimes riding a horse, potentially with armor on top of them, holding a sword in one hand. Like, you hear about, for example, the bravery of Sayyidina Khalid bin Walid, when the Prophet ﷺ actually called him Sayful Islam, right? That battle that he was in, he smashed 21 swords in Romans. Think about that. These are majorly heavy swords. Where he's going into battle on a horse, holding the horse, that's a battle horse. So the horse is moving quickly with one hand, holding the sword in the other hand, and controlling the rest of the horse with his legs. Like, the amount of physical fitness is unbelievable. So, and I'm giving this example because we watch all these superhero movies. Oh, look what the Avengers, Infinity Wars did. But these people are real. Like this is real stuff. So, أَطَمَّتْ قَدَمَهُ literally means he cut off his leg at the knee. So he fell. Abu Hakam, Abu Jahl. He falls on this. أَطَمَّتْ قَدَمَهُ بِنِصْفِ سَاقِهِ. And by the way, is anyone here a doctor? This is very difficult to do. It doesn't matter how strong you are. If you try to slaughter a lamb, even an Eid al-Adha, right? This is a difficult thing to do, right? To do what he just did. So Abu Jahl falls. His son Ikrimah is the one that's awake around his father. By the way, Ikrimah radiallahu anhu accepts Islam, right? 11th year, right? Afterwards, right? What did Sayyidina Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl do? What was his contribution? Does anyone know? To Islam. Yeah, but what big contributions did he make?
He was the leader in Sham.
He's the one that liberated Asham. He actually went east. So he went past Persia. Sayyidina Ikrimah, this is a lesson for us in that how evil the father was, how good the son is now, right? Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl is the one that liberated, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, all these countries were Sayyidina Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl. Him and Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid used to be the leaders of the Quraysh cavalry, which was the most powerful weapon. Like today, how we think of tanks. Tanks in those days were the horses. That's what they had, right? One was on the left flank, one was on the right flank. Right? And so we know the story in Uhud, the encirclement of the Muslims was by Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid because of his cavalry. He waited for the right moment, then he attacked. Right? So Sayyidina Ikrimah, he strikes him on his hand at the shoulder, and he basically cuts the hand. That hand is just attached to the body through the skin. And he says, I fought the rest of the day with my hand just disconnected from my body, and then he became a shaheed by the end of the day. Right, he became a shaheed by the end of the day, right? Okay. And then what happened is, وضربني ابنه بكلمة, so he said the story. فطرح يدي وتعلق بجلدة من جنبي ولقد قاتلت عامة يومي وأنا أسحبها خلفي فلما أذتني وضعت عليها قدمي ثم تمطيت عليها حتى قطعتها ثم مر بي أبو جهل ومر معاذ بن عفراء. So Mu'adh ibn Afra, his companion, took the opportunity there. So Abu Jahl is now hurt on the ground. He went and he attacks Abu Jahl one more time, right? فضربه حتى أثبته وبه رمقة, which means he attacked him one more time, but he still had a bit of life in him. He wasn't quite dead. So question, who is the one that finished off Abu Jahl? No. Who? Ibn Mas'ud. Ibn Mas'ud. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Remember, what was his job? As a shepherd. He was what you'd call a poor farm boy. And they used to make fun of him all the time. They used to beat him up all the time. He had no protection from some powerful tribe or a clan. He is the one that went and climbed on top of Abu Jahl and actually finished him off at the end. And when he actually climbs and look at the arrogance of the man, he says to him, "You've risen on a very mighty position, you son of a shepherd." Right? And he is the one that actually finishes off Abu Jahl. And remember that after the Battle of Badr, what did they do? The Muslims, remember, they threw away the bodies of the disbelievers. And what did the Prophet ﷺ do? He went and he said to them, "I have found what Allah has promised me to be true," meaning victory. Have you found what Allah has promised you to be true? He's speaking to dead bodies. So the companions say, "Ya Rasulullah, why are you speaking if they're dead? They can't hear anything. What's wrong with you?" Or what does he say to them? They hear me the same way that you hear me. But the difference is they cannot respond. Right? So I just wanted to call this out until this is just kind of one of the situations of Badr. And as I said, when you go home and watch this clip, because this is really good. We'll talk about. Should we talk about one more companion and then move on and then go home? We'll do it next week. One more. This is really short. Okay. So we'll talk about Osama ibn Zayd and then we'll go. So Osama ibn Zayd was 18 years old. 18 years old, right? So he was like 12th grade. I don't know, 12th grade by our standards, or what is that? First year of university? You guys keep me honest. Yeah, high school. Okay. So Osama ibn Zayd was. This is at the time of the death of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ had prepared an army to go north to fight the Romans. Right. The previous battle was. Remember how I said on that map that there's a tribe that worked on behalf of the Romans. They were called Al-Ghasasina, and they were defeated. So now because they were operating on behalf of the Romans, the Prophet ﷺ sent now an army to the Romans. Look how Islam changed from pure defense now to offense. Like the situation completely changed, right? And this was obviously after Fath Makkah and so forth. And Osama ibn Zayd, just by way of background, do you know what his father did? Does anyone know what his father did? What was his father's job? Do you know? Or are you playing it here? Okay, you're playing it here. He was? Yeah, what was his job?
He used to have Prophet.
He was a servant. He was a servant. He was a servant. Like even in modern day terms, like you think of a servant, that's what he was. His father was a servant. His mother actually used to be a slave. And I'm saying this. I'm saying this because it shows that the background doesn't matter. It's what he has potential to do. It's what he has potential to do. By the way, another thing that he was not known for was what? Being good looking. So much so that the Prophet ﷺ, one time, the Prophet ﷺ is telling him, "Aren't you going to get married?" He says, "Who would marry me, Ya Rasulullah?" He's like, "Who would marry me? Look how ugly I am." You know? And he actually ends up marrying someone very beautiful. Right? This is Sayyidina Osama ibn Zayd. And Sayyidina Osama ibn Zayd, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, the companion was like, after Abu Bakr became the Khalifa, they said, "Hey, change him out, man. He's a young kid." Literally, they were saying he's a young kid. He's not gonna this is the biggest army ever assembled. Because remember, the Muslim army just grew. Badr had how many people in it? 313. 313. Right? The army that was going south of Mecca, how big was that? 10,000. 10,000, right? So now the armies have got much bigger. So they haven't seen anything on this scale before. So he said, "Abu Bakr, look, he can't run this." He's like, and then he says, "I'm not going to change the person that the Prophet ﷺ appointed." And what does that tell you about the Prophet's decision with respect to Osama ibn Zayd? We'll close with that, inshallah. What does it tell you about his personality? What did he have?
He would give the chance to whoever is worthy.
He would give the chance to whoever is worthy. And he saw in that person that he had leadership capability. He saw that he could run an army. He had strategy. He knew fiqh. He was a brave warrior. Right? He could get people worked up to go and fight. He said, this is a job in of itself. Not everybody can do that. Right? He understood military tactics. He understood how the Romans fight. He understood the different types of weapons available to him. This is technology. It's not just, let's just go and have a fight. Look at what Russia's doing now. Long-range missiles, short-term missile, we have this. Someone has to know all of this to command the army. He doesn't just command the division. He commands the whole army. right? So this example is an example where, the character that they had to show, even at that young age, right, was very, very powerful in its effect on the deen and the outcomes of the ummah. اللهم اغفر لنا وارحمنا انت خير الراحمين ربنا اتنا في الدنيا حسنه وفي الاخره حسنه وقنا عذاب النار ربنا تقبل منا انك انت السميع العليم وتب علينا انك انت التواب الرحيم ربنا ظلمنا انفسنا وان لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين اللهم نسالك الدرجات العلى من الجنه اللهم اهدنا واهد بنا واجعلنا سببا لمن اهتدى واخر دعوانا ان الحمد لله رب العالمين جزاكم الله خيرا and see you guys next week inshallah. Just remember the video. Go home. I'm not telling you, the video is worth seeing. It's 22 minutes. Get your kids. Open up YouTube, Kings and Generals, Battle of Badr. That's all you need to do, okay?